Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Welcome to episode 11 of Talking Point on Wisp Sports Radio, brought to you by Highlands Earache Drops.
Earaches are one of the primary causes for doctor visits, with over 30 million visits per year. After you've been diagnosed with an earache by a physician, try Highlands Homeopathic Earache Drops and Tablets. Highlands Homeopathic Ear Drops and Tablets provide natural relief to help you get back to doing what you love. Visit highlands.com/ear-pain to find a retailer near you. Claims are based on traditional homeopathic practice, not accepted medical evidence, not FDA evaluated. Read and follow label directions.
On Wisp Sports Radio, we delve more deeply into the systemic barriers facing women in sport. I'm your host, Lisa Ingarfield, and Talking Point is co-produced by myself and Wisp Sports. At Wisp Sports, we believe women in sport deserve equal coverage. Last month in episode 10, we spoke with Brenda Andress, Commissioner of the Canadian Women's Hockey League and founder of the She Is campaign. She shared how the campaign came to be and what she hopes it will do for women's sport the world over. This month, we are joined by Anne Lieberman, the Director of Policy and Programs at Athlete Ally, an organization dedicated to elevating and supporting LGBTIQ+ athletes and shifting policy and practice to advance LGBTIQ+ rights. Anne is a queer intersectional feminist and lifelong martial artist. As Director of Policy and Programs at Athlete Ally, she leads the organization's state-based and national LGBTQ rights efforts and mobilizes Athlete Ally ambassadors, sports teams, athletic institutions, and other partners to shift sport policy and advance LGBTQ rights locally and globally. Anne has worked for a decade in advancing LGBTQI rights internationally. Prior to joining Athlete Ally, Anne led grant-making and advocacy efforts in South and Southeast Asia for American Jewish World Service. Before AJWS, Anne was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to conduct research on gender and sexuality in Muay Thai, Thailand's national sport. Prior to her time in Thailand, Anne worked as a research assistant for the Bronx African American History Project and was awarded a Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture Fellowship. Anne holds an MA from Columbia University in Human Rights and a BA in African and African American Studies and Women's Studies from Fordham University. Outside of the office, you can find Anne on the mat at Renzo Gracie Academy, coaching Muay Thai or fighting on the amateur circuit nationally. Anne is a proud member of Jews for Racial Economic Justice, where she serves on their grassroots fundraising committee. Welcome, Anne. We're very excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for all of the work you do to have all of these really important conversations.
Great. You have done a lot of work over the years too. You have a long history of advocating for social justice and LGBTQ rights, it seems. And obviously with your work most recently, it's with on policy nationally and on the state level with Athlete Ally. And I'm wondering if you could just begin by telling us a little bit about Athlete Ally and the work that you do and how listeners might get involved with some of the advocacy projects you're working on.
Sure, absolutely. So as you mentioned in the intro, broadly speaking, we educate and activate athletic communities to eliminate homophobia and transphobia in sports and to exercise their leadership to champion LGBTQ equality. And if you visit us at athleteally.org, you'll see a number of campaigns to become involved in, petitions to sign, and we'll talk about one of those petitions later on in the show. And when we look at our work, kind of the 30,000-foot view, is we have three main pillars. So the first is focus on education. So we all know that people who often need education the most are educated the least. So a lot of our work focuses on educating athletic communities at all levels. So from individual athletes to teams to sport governing bodies, so that they really understand obstacles to inclusion for LGBTQ people in sports and how they can then build inclusive communities on their teams or within their organizations. So just briefly, what that looks like in practice is holding trainings with front office staff of major sports leagues. We've worked with the NBA rookies for the past 4 years, done Pride Nights with teams, and we're also going to be launching an online curriculum for coaches focused on LGBTQ inclusion. And then the second major piece of our work, which is also connected to the third, is sport policy. So one of the major obstacles, again, to LGBTQ inclusion in sports is there's still a patchwork of protections for LGBTQ athletes. So we work to make sure that sport policy is as inclusive as it should be, and that it's also accessible to athletes, especially queer athletes who want to play. And part of the sport policy work is around applying pressure to global sport governing bodies to make sure that their policies are consistent and that they even exist to begin with. And a lot of this work, when we talk about kind of an intersectional analysis of the sports space, a lot of the work has been, we view LGBTQ issues as directly linked to gender equity. So we've launched campaigns calling on World Rugby to adopt trans-inclusive policies. We've joined the Women in FIFA movement to push FIFA Congress to enact reforms for women in soccer. We partnered with Shirzan, which is a media and advocacy organization for Muslim female athletes, to end the hijab ban. So all of this is directly related to, our work on LGBTQ inclusion. And so that sport policy work and the way we mobilize our constituents and our athletes is directly connected to our third pillar of work, which is really focused on athlete activism. So we believe so strongly in our organization that athlete activism should be, even though in many instances it is not, accepted and expected. So we have an ambassador program, yes. So we have an ambassador program that is now over 200 pro, Paralympic, and Olympic ambassadors. And a big part of what we do is organize and mobilize them around different LGBTQ-focused social justice issues, both related to sport policy, as with the new, and I'm saying new in air quotes, we'll talk about that in a moment, new IAAF regulation, but also more broadly.
I love that piece about athletes, that we should actually expect them to be activists, right? Because they do have a platform and they're role models for a lot of people. And so I think that they're very well positioned to address some of these social issues that are really restricting access to a lot of people to sport. That's really great. Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of times in your discussion of Athlete Ally some of the big issues that are happening right now. And I know that Athlete Ally has been working on the IAAF's recent regulation concerning women and the levels of naturally occurring testosterone in their body, to the point where they're actually articulating a required level that women, to compete as women, have to fall below, which in some cases means that women athletes are going to have to alter their body to meet that standard. And obviously, Caster Semenya is a very famous athlete who has a higher level of naturally occurring testosterone, and she is also the women's world and Olympic record holder for the 800 meters. And so this new IAAF regulation is a newer regulation, because I believe they had an older one that was overturned by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And so now they've introduced this next one. And recently, in the last couple of months, Athlete Ally released an open letter in opposition to this new regulation, signed by a significant number of athletes, articulating that this is a fundamentally discriminatory practice and policy. And so I'm wondering if you could just begin by talking us through some of the key issues that have manifested here.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, this regulation is not really new. We say new in air quotes because it is a different version of a regulation that was previously overturned by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And so an interesting piece of background about that regulation is that, in 2015, CAS ruled that the regulation couldn't stand because there was not enough available scientific evidence that there was any performance advantage caused by higher natural testosterone. and that performance advantage was so substantial that it warranted excluding women from competition. And I think, part of what this brings up is there are so many levels of complexity that go into how we think about and how we understand competitive advantage. When we think about all the other way athletes have competitive advantage, access to better coaches and facilities, money to pay for nutritionists, recovery services, all of these different pieces, right? So, at the highest levels of sport, physical characteristics can only get you so far. You also need serious technical skill to be able to beat top competitors from around the world. So it's a combination of factors that create an elite athlete. So there's this one piece right around competitive advantage, but then there's this other incredibly problematic issue, which is, why is it that the female category in sports is so heavily policed and has been policed since beginning in the 1930s, but really started to take shape in the 1960s when this humiliating practice of sex testing women was occurring at the highest levels of sport. So this is another kind of overarching question when we think about bodily autonomy, when we think about the way in which women in sport either do or don't have control over their bodies, and why, in this particular instance with this regulation, why are only certain events being targeted and not others? So there are a whole host of issues to really dig into here.
Well, and it's the 400 meters to a mile, up to the mile, right? So that, and then, so I'm not sure what the rationale is behind that, presumably because women are moving at faster speeds, therefore the competitive advantage is more severe. I don't know.
So here's the thing that is very problematic about this regulation. So first, many independent researchers have called the IAAF data out as incredibly flawed, as a methodology being flawed, not replicable, all of these issues. But let's just pretend for a moment that the IAAF data is sound. The biggest discrepancies in terms of competitive advantage were found in the hammer throw and the pole vault. But are those included in the new regulation? No. And so, as you mentioned, what's included is every single one of Caster Semenya's events from 400 meters to the mile. And by the way, there was no data even collected on the mile. So there are all kinds of then kind of political issues that come out with this, gendered issues. And also when we think about the legacy of colonialism in sport, it's very intersectional. There's a reason why only women of color from global South countries are being policed.
Yes, I think this is a really complex issue. And then it also, for me, taps into this narrative about what does it mean to be a woman and who gets to claim that label. And then who, like you said, who's policing it, right? So the presumption that if you have a higher level of naturally occurring testosterone, then there's something fundamentally unwomanly about you, feels really troubling to me.
Absolutely. And it's this idea that somehow when women become too strong in their sport, too fast, too strong, that they somehow race themselves even out of the female category. And, we've done a lot of work. So when we organized this open letter, we did it in partnership with Women's Sports Foundation. And it was really a powerful joint effort between our athlete ambassadors and theirs. And we also worked with a medical anthropologist, Katrina Karkaisis, who has spent a lot of time studying testosterone and actually has a new book coming out soon that's dedicated to testosterone and some of the mythology around testosterone. So it's also about how we're messaging and understanding certain quote unquote biological advantages and not taking into account other factors, as I mentioned previously.
And then I think back in history about how science has been used to maintain discriminatory and oppressive exclusionary practices, right? And so it feels simply like a revamp or a regurgitation of these older narratives that essentially give one group an advantage over others, or maybe the advantage is not the word, one group power over another group.
Absolutely. And one of the conversations we also have been having quite a bit is we now have come to more of an understanding as a society, even in some more conservative spaces, that gender is on a spectrum, that gender is not binary. But the conversation we are not having as much that we need to be having is that biological sex is also on a spectrum, and it has also been politicized, and we're now seeing this come up when we talk about international athletic competition and athletes who are defined by medical communities as intersex, who may or may not identify themselves as being intersex.
So you mentioned earlier about the sex testing that had happened, right? And how athletes, women athletes in particular, had to quote unquote prove their identity, and how troubling and problematic that practice is. And I'm wondering, just for our listeners who don't know much about that practice, if you would be able to share a little bit more about it.
Sure, absolutely. So, as I mentioned previously, women have been forced to undergo verification testing at the highest levels of sport for a long, long time. And what the practice really started as was inspecting women's genitals to make sure that they were truly, quote unquote, female. And then it morphed into a different practice of testing blood, testing hormones, testing a number of different things. But actually, interestingly, the IAAF was the first international sport governing body to answer this call to test athletes in the 60s, and had what was called a nude parade, where they required female athletes to parade naked in front of doctors. And though this nude parade doesn't occur, women's privacy and bodies continue to be violated. And I think there's also a question, I've also been in conversation with some very high level athletes who say, well, listen, when you are a very high level athlete, you give up your right to privacy. And of course, these athletes who have said this have been male identified athletes, because men are not required to undergo gender verification testing. And so it's also, there's a very paternalistic hysteria about, quote unquote, protecting the integrity of women's competition. And, there's another thing that I want to be very clear about, which is, women's sports, for me, as a female, as a queer female, as a coach, as an athlete, are very, very important. And so I think when some people talk about this, this gender policing, the IAAF, because it's a very polarizing topic, people think, well, we're just going to do away with the female category. And what we're saying is, no, this sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for all women, because this is not just about, it's a slippery slope. And so that's why we had such overwhelming support from athletes like Megan Rapinoe and Billie Jean King and really high level names, because they understand this to be a greater conversation about bodily integrity and control over one's body.
Absolutely. And that is multi-layered and intersectional, as you had stated before. And we'll include links in the show notes to the Athlete Ally letter and then to the IAAF response. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about their response to your letter. I read it and I found it to be mildly offensive, and it felt very defensive, kind of a knee-jerk reaction, if you will. And they also make reference to youth sports in they make a kind of blanketed comparison between women's sports and youth sports. So I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you so much for talking about this. So we actually just responded to the IAAF, and we'll be publishing that response on our website on Monday. We wanted to give them an opportunity to respond privately, which I don't think that they will respond again. But when we saw that first response, we knew that they saw the athlete open letter as a serious issue and a threat, because they responded almost immediately and in writing, and then went public with the statement. And then there was additional media pickup around their response to the Athlete Ally and Women's Sports Foundation letter. And so there are a number of things that are problematic about their response, as you already mentioned. So the first piece is they keep hanging on to this narrative that they're not trying to prevent women from competing. But women don't have a choice if they're forced to compete in a male category, which, by the way, they can't do legally, or an intersex category, which to our knowledge doesn't exist and is not going to exist. And then the second layer to that is they just are continuing to dig their heels in behind data that is fundamentally flawed. And so in our response to them, we cite a number of studies that call out the integrity of the data, the methodology, and then the other piece as well is in thinking about the precedent this could set. And in the previous case that was taken to Cass, in Cass's ruling, Cass considered the rights of all women athletes and talked about the Olympic Charter and the IAAF Constitution. And they concluded that the regulation was discriminatory and infringed on the rights of a minority group. So we're talking about a regulation that actually, in certain contexts around the world, would not hold up in court. And then the conversation about comparing women's sports to youth sports was just, another way in which they further infantilize women's participation in sport. And then for me also, I was actually very happy that they wanted to talk about weight class sports, because I was like, I have been teaching Muay Thai, I've been coaching, I've been doing this martial art for a decade, spent my whole life growing up doing martial arts, and we are divided by weight class. And never once have any athletes I know in my network been forced into a particular weight class by a sport governing body or asked to medically alter their body in order to compete in a particular weight class. So none of the comparisons that they're trying to make are analogous. They're not fair and they're not accurate. So their response was, it felt a lot of it actually cobbled together. It felt a little bit frantic. And I think you'll see, I don't know if you had a chance to see the Human Rights Watch letter that was also sent to Lord Coe. But if not, I can also provide you that link for the show notes, because, Human Rights Watch also makes a lot of similar points, and also talks about the research that they have done around intersex human rights and bodily autonomy, bodily integrity, and the way in which the IAAF policies and practices are in direct conflict with intersex human rights. So I think, now when we talk about next steps and what's going to happen, the IAAF has been just dug their heels in so hard that I don't necessarily see them rescinding the regulation, but I do think that public pressure is going to continue to build, and I 100% think that they are going to lose the battle at Cass again.
Yes, it certainly seems that way, and to respond so frantically and so quickly, it didn't appear as though they put a lot of thought into their response. And I think that is ultimately going to hurt them. And it's interesting, right? Because they say, and I'm looking at the letter right now, and they say in here, that women, who have testosterone levels above this seemingly arbitrary level, they'll be eligible to compete in male and intersex competition. Period. The choice is theirs. Period. Right. So, that is even just ridiculous to me. Just even the way they framed that. But like you identified, there's currently no intersex competition. Right. That's not a thing.
Yes. Correct.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Right. So when we think about sports is just completely predicated on this gender and sex binary, and yet they're articulating in this letter that these women aren't being excluded. They can choose where they participate, right? Look, we're giving them all these choices, but one of the choices doesn't even exist.
Actually, neither choice really exists, because they can't compete in the male category because they're legally not men. So it's incredible. And that whole line about the choice is theirs. It's like, this is not the Matrix. It just felt so, rushed and
That's so great. This is not the Matrix. Like, take the blue, what is it, the red pill or the green pill or something? Yeah.
Yeah, but the other thing too, Lisa, that deeply upsets me is you're talking about, as an athlete, as a coach, you are talking about athletes who have overcome all odds to be able to participate. You are talking about Caster Semenya, who is from rural Limpopo in South Africa, Duty Chand, who had the previous case, who's from a rural part of India, who didn't have access to the same kind of training facilities, all those other pieces that I spoke about before around competitive advantage. And they overcame all odds to compete at the highest level of their sport. And that is not only because they are, physically, quote unquote different, or so there just needs to be a broader conversation about equity across the board that isn't only about testosterone. And I think, one of the reasons why I'm so excited for Katrina's book is because, she really deconstructs a lot of the myths around testosterone and the way in which testosterone interacts, with other hormones in the body. She talks about, really the detailed science. And it's just I've read parts of it, and I just can't wait for it to come out, because I think it's really going to change how we think about competitive advantage. And I think years from now, we're going to look back on the work that's being done now and really be absolutely horrified at, more people, not just Athlete Ally Women's Sports Foundation, the folks that are, entrenched in these discussions around human rights in sports, are going to look back and be horrified that they sat by and let these female athletes be treated like this.
Well, and I think that is true throughout history, right? There have been some extraordinarily shameful moments, particularly in US history and, globally, that, we look back on some 50 years later and are shocked to think that we ever got to that point. And I think that this is an evolution, and there's that I'm going to butcher this, but there's that phrase about the history follows the arc towards justice or something, which is so not exactly the phrase, but like, it's what you're saying, that we're going to take a step forward in a couple of decades and look back and say, how did we get to that place? Like, how did we let that happen? And I think that obviously hindsight is 2020, but really right now, the work that you're doing at Athlete Ally and other advocacy organizations that are really kind of pushing this issue to the forefront and saying, let's not get to the place where we look back and be ashamed about what we did, right? Let's draw a line in the sand right now. And this competitive advantage thing is so interesting, because when you were talking about that, I was thinking about triathlon, which is the sport that I participate in. And I think about kind of a lot of the enhancements that individuals have access to based on socioeconomic status, right? So yes, so they have digital gear changing on their bikes, right? They have these various fancy wheels that are more aerodynamic, and they have they sit in wind tunnels for hours on end to have the suit that gives them the most kind of second advantage in terms of wind resistance. And, Joe Schmo random athlete doesn't have access to all of that. So, and that's a massive competitive advantage. Then that is not born of biology, right?
Absolutely. And triathletes are actually a fantastic example of that because of all the gear.
Right. And then, so thinking about folks who kind of come back to this, they can't get past, it's not fair, right? We want sports to be fair. It needs to be, women need to be competing fairly against other women, men against other men. And so, when we think about equity, I understand equity is slightly different from fairness, but fairness is certainly the avenue that the IAAF is taking. And I think that that's probably where a lot of people begin and end their discussion, is that it needs to be fair, and these women are creating unfair competition. Like, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think there's such an emphasis on testosterone because we believe it to be the hormone that provides the most competitive advantage. It is the differentiation between, levels of testosterone are the differentiation between male and female athletes, when in reality, that at the elite levels, there is an absolute overlap between men and women in their testosterone levels. And there are men that are at a lower range, similar to women. Women are at a higher range. So there's actually even the way in which we understand levels of testosterone at the highest levels of sport, there is an overlap. And so when we think about fairness in competition and the science, is there really an advantage? And we don't know that. But we are hyper focused on that. And I also think that when we think about fairness in competition, it's this argument that it hurts me deeply as a female athlete, because so are we saying that the rights of some women are more important than others? Are we saying that so I can win a gold medal based on fundamentally flawed science, that Caster Semenya should be forced to undergo medically unnecessary intervention? How does that make sense? How is that fair? So I think that that's something that is really powerful to me when we think about fairness, and also that even the way we understand fairness and competitive advantage has been through frameworks that have been dictated by and developed by men. So it's like there are so many ways in which we hold on to certain ideologies that we believe to be true, but we need to, as a sports community, as athletes, as sports fans, be willing to do the work, do the reading, have the conversations about these issues.
Yeah, so that's a really key piece, is if you're getting stuck on fairness, it's understanding that this issue is really much broader than testosterone, and that hanging your hat on fairness through the lens of testosterone and advantage is a limited way to understand the issue. And there's a lot more research that you could do to really gain the depth of understanding about how much more complicated this is. Would you say? Okay. Because I think that's, I hear that a lot around fairness, and I understand why folks get to that point. I do. And I think that we need to challenge people to move beyond this fixation on testosterone that you've articulated, and that, is going to be discussed in this book, which we'll include a link in the show notes related to the book too. I think that it's hard for folks, right? Because this also comes back to some of the fundamental structures that you're challenging here around gender and around sex, and that neither are binaries, and that there is no quote unquote normal way to identify your gender or present your gender, right? There are manifestations of gender and sex that are advantaged in our system, right? That people are policed back into those boxes, which is essentially what's happening here. So I think that it's kind of rocking at the foundation of our many of our understanding of what is right and normal.
Absolutely. When we think about the next generation of athletes, the Generation Zers, I believe that they're called, over half of those folks don't identify with a binary gender. So what is going to happen when that generation starts to be more active in sports? We say this all the time in our work because we see it through the athlete activism, that sport is on a collision course with society, that these are going to be conversations that, we are definitely having more and more as an organization. But sport governing bodies are starting to grapple with these issues more and more. And we are going to have to find a way to create a sports world and a sports community that lets everyone play, that lets everyone run. And for us, that really is our North Star, is that everyone, regardless of gender identity, sexual orientation, sex characteristics, race, class, ability, everyone should be able to play sports.
Well, and that is the narrative of sport, right? So When you think about how sport is marketed, it is the great uniter. It is a team builder. It is something that develops leadership skills and the capacity to work well with others. I mean, that's the narrative that's out there. But in reality, there's still a significant amount of exclusion that happens in sport, obviously, when we're talking about women. And then this IAAF regulation just kind of takes that to a whole new level in terms of discrimination around women's identity biology. And then let's intersect that with colonialism and racism and classism, right? And so there's a disconnect between what we say sport is and what sport actually is currently, I think.
Absolutely. 100%.
So obviously this is a huge conversation, and we could probably talk for the next 10 hours about this. And I don't know that our listeners would be willing to stay with us for that long. So to wrap up, what can listeners do? So if we've piqued people's interest and they want to learn more, obviously we'll put a ton of information in the show notes, but how can they get involved with Athlete Ally? What are your recommendations?
So the first would be just to visit us at athleteally.org. Sign up with us, sign the IAAF petition, because in addition to the open letter, we also have a petition in partnership with the Women's Sports Foundation that we're still collecting signatures on. So that is an amazing way to stay engaged. And also, if there are other issues that we're involved in that are of particular interest, to definitely shoot me an email. You can put my email in the show notes as well, because we build this movement person by person, and we have amazing folks in our network from that kind of outreach. So we want to hear from you. If you are a queer athlete and you are struggling, we want to hear from you. If you are a trans or non-binary athlete listening and you want to play, you want to run, contact us. We have folks we can connect you to. We can do some work with you. So that's what I would say.
All right, that's great. There's a lot of opportunities to get engaged. And I think I would just say that, we've come a long way, but we still have a really long way to go. And we don't want to be looking back on this moment in time 20 years from now and feeling shameful about it, because there's something fundamentally wrong with the direction that the IAAF is going, in my humble opinion. And so I think that this is the opportunity for us to speak up and to really say, we don't agree. So thank you so much, Anne. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. Thank you.
Good. We really hope that this has provided a point of education for our listeners, and that folks are willing and ready to get involved and sign that petition. It's an easy thing that you can do. And we will look forward to talking a little bit more about this. And I'm excited to see how the IAAF responds to your letter in response to their letter.
As are we.
All right. Well, thanks again so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Conversations from the world of women's sports. This is Wisp Sports Radio.
Thanks again to Anne Lieberman for joining us today to talk about Athlete Ally and the issue of policing womanhood in sports. We will include links to everything that we talked about in today's show, so you can continue to learn more about the issue and support Athlete Ally and others in this work. Also, don't forget to visit our sponsors at highlands.com/ear-pain. For show notes, including related links and a full transcript of the episode, visit wispsports.com. You can also find hundreds of additional podcasts on Wisp Sports Radio. Subscribe to us using your preferred podcast player, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. For more conversations from the world of women's sport, including blogs, articles, and videos, visit us at wispsports.com. Post your comments, questions, and suggestions on our Facebook page, or email us at info@wispsports.com, and follow, share, and like @wispsports on social media. You can reach me, Lisa Ingarfield, directly at TriDeFi, that's TRITODEFI, on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening and supporting women in sport everywhere. We'll be back next month with another in-depth, thought-provoking conversation.